Hey guys, welcome back to more HOA stories. Imagine you bought a beautiful ranch, but then a homeowner association Karen demands that you pay $100,000 in past dues for supposedly violating HOA laws. This is exactly what happened to OP. Let's dive right into the story. And the first one starts like this. So my parents had been gone for 6 months when I finally worked up the courage to clean out their house. My mom's cancer had been swift and merciless, and my dad followed her 3 weeks later. The doctors said it was a heart attack, but I knew better. 42 years of marriage doesn't just end with one person walking away. I was 38, burned out from crunching numbers in a downtown high-rise, and suddenly alone in the world with a modest inheritance and a growing certainty that my life had taken a wrong turn somewhere. Every morning I would wake up in my sterile apartment, ride the elevator down to the underground parking and drive through gridlock traffic to spend 8 hours analyzing data that would help some corporations squeeze a few more pennies out of their quarterly projections. Then I'd reverse the process and fall asleep watching Netflix. My grandparents had been ranchers, real ones with calloused hands and stories about fixing fence lines in snowstorms. They had raised cattle and crops and children who knew the value of hard work. Somewhere along the way, their son had traded dirt for diplomas and their grandson had traded purpose for a paycheck. The inheritance was not life-changing money, but it was enough to buy a chance. I spent weeks scrolling through real estate listings looking for something that felt like coming home instead of just changing addresses. When I found the ranch, I knew immediately it was the one. 97 acres of rolling hills, weathered fencing, and a farmhouse that had seen better decades, but still stood solid against the elements. The photos showed a red barn that leaned slightly to the left, corrals that needed repair, and pastures that had not seen cattle in years. It was beautiful in the way that broken things can be when they are waiting for someone to care about them again. The property had been in agricultural use for nearly a century, passed down through generations until the last owner's family finally decided to sell rather than maintain it. The real estate agent was thorough, almost aggressively so, walking me through every detail of the sale with the kind of methodical precision that suggested she had dealt with city folks buying rural dreams before. The property is zoned agricultural residential, she explained as we stood in the kitchen, sunlight streaming through windows that framed views of open sky. This gives you substantial protections for farming activities. You can raise livestock, grow crops, operate farm equipment, the works. I signed more papers than I'd signed buying my apartment, but my lawyer insisted on the thoroughness. Title insurance surveys, deed searches, the full parade of due diligence that comes with purchasing land. When the dust settled, I held a thick folder of documents that confirmed what I already knew in my heart. This was home. The suburban development next door seemed like an afterthought, a cluster of identical houses with perfect lawns and matching mailboxes. From my kitchen window I could see their neat little community, all beige siding and manicured hedges. It looked like a movie set for a life I'd never wanted to live. Moving day was a revelation though. As I carried boxes from the truck to the house, I realized I could not hear traffic. No sirens, no construction, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, just wind in the grass and the distant call of birds I couldn't identify yet. For the first time in years, my shoulders relaxed. The work began immediately. Fencing that had sagged under years of weather needed to be stretched tight. The barn required new boards where the old ones had rotted, and I learned to operate a tractor slowly and with much cursing, but I learned. My hands, soft from years of keyboard work, developed calluses and cuts that I wore like badges of honor. Every morning I would wake up sore and satisfied, fall asleep exhausted and content. This was what my grandfather had tried to tell me about honest work. This was what I'd been missing in my climate-controlled office tower. The first sign of trouble came wrapped in cellophane and tied with a yellow ribbon. I was unloading feed from my truck when a woman approached from the direction of the subdivision, middle-aged, perfectly put together in that aggressive suburban way, carrying a wicker basket like she was auditioning for a community theater production. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she chirped, holding out the basket with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I'm from the community association next door. We like to greet all new neighbors." I accepted the basket, which was heavier than it looked. Muffins, some kind of jam, a small potted plant. The gesture seemed friendly enough, if a bit presumptuous. "That's very kind of you. I'm still getting settled, but I appreciate the thought." "Oh, we are all so excited to have you here. The previous owner was, well, let's just say he was not very community-minded. We are hoping for better things now." She lingered for a moment, eyes scanning my property with the kind of appraisal that suggested she was cataloging everything she saw. Then she smiled again and headed back towards the subdivision, leaving me standing in my driveway with a basket of baked goods and an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't quite name. It was not until that evening that I discovered what had made the basket so heavy. Beneath the muffins and jam was a thick booklet bound in blue covers titled Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions for something called the Community Association. A yellow sticky note was attached to the front cover, just so you're aware of the community standards. I flipped through the pages, growing more incredulous with each rule: mailbox specifications, approved paying colors, and even restrictions on outdoor storage. Regulations about lawn maintenance, holiday decorations, and vehicle parking. 67 pages of micromanagement disguised as community building. The most interesting part was the property map on page 12. I spread my deed and survey on the kitchen table next to the booklet and compared the boundaries. According to my documents, the association's territory ended exactly where my fence line began. The legal descriptions were crystal clear. My property was specifically excluded from their jurisdiction. I should have thrown the booklet away. Instead, I filed it in my desk drawer, dismissing it as the kind of presumptuous overreach that happens when suburban bureaucrats get bored. I had work to do, and their little rules didn't apply to me anyway. The watching started about a week later. At first I thought I was imagining it, a car slowing down as it passed my driveway. Someone standing at their fence line staring across at my property while I worked in the yard. It was subtle, easy to dismiss as coincidence or even paranoia, but it continued. When I was mending fence, I would notice figures in the distance, watching from the subdivision. When I loaded hay bales, cars would pause at the end of my driveway before moving on. It felt like living in a fishbowl, constantly getting observed and evaluated by an audience I had not asked for. I tried to ignore it. I'd come here for solitude and honest work, not to worry about what the neighbors thought of my lifestyle choices, but the sensation of being watched, of being judged by invisible standards I didn't understand or accept, began to wear on me. Several months passed in relative peace. I replaced rotted fence posts, cleared overgrown pastures, and slowly brought the ranch back to something resembling functionality. My savings account shrank, but my sense of purpose grew. This was the life I was meant to live, but then came the letter. I found the certified mail slip in my mailbox on a Tuesday evening after spending the day repairing the gate that led to the back pasture. The post office was closed, so I had to wait until the next morning to pick it up. I remember standing in the parking lot holding the envelope with its official return address, feeling a sense of dread I could not even explain. The letter had belonged to a law firm I'd never heard of, representing the community HOA association I'd never joined. The words swam before my eyes as I read, "Notice of lien and demand for payment, $100,000 in past dues, accrued fines and interest dating back 20 years. 30 days to pay or face foreclosure proceedings." I read it 3 times before the reality sank in. According to these people, I owed them more money than I'd paid for the ranch itself. For violations of rules I'd never agreed to follow from an organization I'd never joined, on property I'd legally purchased with clear title. Standing in that post office parking lot holding a letter that threatened to destroy everything I had built, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not the quiet desperation of my corporate days, not the grief of losing my parents, but pure crystalline anger. They had mistaken my desire for peace as weakness. They thought they could bully me into submission with an official letterhead and legal threats, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my truck. Then I drove home to my ranch, my sanctuary, my one shot at a meaningful life. The place I would defend with everything I had, because some battles are worth fighting and some ground is worth holding. The war was just beginning and they had fired the first shot. My first instinct was to call my real estate lawyer, but something stopped me. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was naive optimism, but I decided to try resolving this like adults first. The demand letter listed an address for the association president, and I figured a face-to-face conversation might clear up what had to be a misunderstanding. I gathered my folder of property documents and drove the quarter mile to the subdivision. The house matched the neighborhood perfectly: beige siding, manicured lawn, flowers planted in precise geometric patterns. Even the doormat looked like it had been positioned with a ruler. The woman who answered the door was the same one who had brought me the welcome basket, though her demeanor had shifted from artificially sweet to coolly professional. She looked at my work clothes and dirty hands with barely concealed distaste. "I got your letter," I said, holding up the legal notice. I think there's been some kind of mistake." "Oh, there's no mistake." Her voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You inherited the previous owner's obligations when you purchased the property. 20 years of unpaid dues and violations add up." I opened my folder and pulled out the deed survey and title report. Well, actually, if you will just look at these documents, you will see that my property was never part of your association. The boundaries are clearly marked. She did not even glance at the papers. "The original parcel was included in our charter. Legal technicalities don't change the facts. You owe us money and we intend to collect it." But I was never given the opportunity to join or decline membership. I never signed any agreement. "That's not how this works." She smiled, the kind of smile that people use when explaining obvious things to slow children. "The debt runs with the land. Get yourself a lawyer if you want, but you're gonna lose. We've been dealing with problem properties for years." Problem properties? Properties that don't maintain community standards. The previous owner let the place fall apart and now you're continuing the pattern. This is a quality neighborhood and we intend to keep it that way. Standing on her perfect porch looking at her perfect lawn, I finally understood what I was up against. This was not about money or legal technicalities. This was just about control, about forcing conformity on someone who had the audacity to live differently right next to their suburban paradise. "I see," I said quietly. "Well, thank you for clarifying your position." I drove home in a cold fury, not at the injustice of their demands, but at my own stupidity for thinking reasonable people could be reasoned with. They had declared war on my way of life and they expected me to surrender without a fight. That afternoon, I called every lawyer in the phone book until I found one who specialized in property disputes and had experience with HOAs. The receptionist scheduled me for the next morning. The law office was everything the subdivision wasn't. Weathered brick, creaking floors and bookshelves that sagged under the weight of decades of legal precedent. The lawyer himself looked like he'd stepped out of a Western movie, complete with boots and a bolo tie. He listened to my story without interruption, occasionally nodding or making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Let me see those documents," he said when I finished. He spread my papers across his desk with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. After several minutes of silent examination, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Well, this is interesting. You say they are claiming that you inherited the previous owner's membership obligations?" "That's what she told me, yeah. She said the debt runs with the land. Only if the land was properly included in the original association charter and only if the property owner consented to join." He tapped his pen against the legal pad. "Tell me, did you ever see any documentation showing that the previous owner actually joined this association?" "Well, the welcome basket had their rule booklet and there was a property map, but my land was clearly outside their boundaries." "Good, that's very good." He stood up and walked to a filing cabinet. "I've dealt with this particular association before. Bunch of petty tyrants with delusions of legal authority. They like to throw around big words and official letterhead, but they don't always do their homework. So, you think I have a case?" "Well, son, I think you've got them dead to rights, but we need to prove it. That means a trip to the county courthouse to pull some records." "You free tomorrow?" The courthouse was a study in bureaucratic efficiency and historical neglect. We spent the better part of a day navigating between departments, requesting files and examining documents that had not seen daylight in years. My lawyer moved through the process with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. "Here we go," he said, spreading a large sheet across the reading table. "Original plat map for the subdivision, filed 20 years ago." The map showed the development as it existed today, with numbered lots and clearly marked boundaries. At the bottom of the page was a section titled "Consent to a Joint Association," with signature lines for all affected property owners. Most of the lines were filled in with neat signatures and dates, but one line corresponding to my ranch was completely blank. "They never got his signature," I said, staring at the empty space. "They never got his signature," my lawyer confirmed. Which means they never had legal authority to include his property in their association, which means they sure as hell don't have authority over you. So this whole thing is completely bogus, built on a foundation of wishful thinking and legal ignorance. He folded the map carefully. "But here's the thing about bullies. They don't usually back down just because you show them they are wrong. They double down, and he was right." After the courthouse visit, I received another certified letter, this one informing me that the association had officially filed a lien against my property. According to the notice, I now had 20 days to pay the full amount or face foreclosure proceedings. "That was fast," my lawyer said when I called him. "Looks like they're committed to this course of action. What do we do now?" "Now we file a lawsuit for slander of title and abuse of process. But that will take months to work through the courts and legal fees are not cheap." "How much are we talking about?" "Well, depends on how long they want to drag this out. Could be 5,000, could be 20, maybe more if they hire some big city firm." I did the math in my head. My savings were already stretched from buying and improving the ranch. A prolonged legal battle could bankrupt me, even if I won. "There's another option," my lawyer said, and I could hear something like amusement in his voice. "Your property is zoned agricultural, right? And you're planning to operate it as a working ranch?" "That's the idea." "Well, agricultural zoning comes with certain protections. Activities that might be considered nuisances in residential areas are perfectly legal on agricultural land. If someone wanted to make life uncomfortable for overly aggressive neighbors, there are ways to do that while staying completely within the law." "What kind of ways?" "Ever heard of composting? It's a standard agricultural practice, perfectly legal, environmentally responsible, and fragrant." The idea took root immediately. If they wanted to play hardball with liens and lawsuits, I could play by these agricultural rules. Rules that had been written to protect farmers from exactly this kind of suburban interference. I spent the next week researching county regulations and agricultural exemptions. Everything my lawyer had suggested was not only legal, but actively encouraged by various environmental agencies. Large-scale composting was considered a best practice for sustainable farming. The dairy farm 20 miles away was happy to deliver. For a modest fee, they would bring in as much organic material as I wanted. The truck driver was professional and efficient, dumping load after load of fresh cow manure in a carefully planned location on my property. I had chosen the spot with deliberate precision, directly upwind from the association's president's house and the main entrance to their subdivision, but well within my property lines and in full compliance with setback requirements. The pile grew throughout the morning, a steaming mountain of agricultural necessity. Very soon the smell had become noticeable. The first complaints started around dinner time. My phone rang constantly, but I'd learned not to answer numbers I didn't recognize. The voicemails were increasingly frantic, demands that I move the pile, threats of legal action, offers to work something out. The association president showed up at my fence line the next morning, along with several neighbors and what appeared to be a county inspector. They just stood at the property boundary, pointing and gesturing while the inspector took notes and measurements. I walked over to meet them, carrying a folder of documents and wearing my most helpful expression. "You need to move that pile immediately," the president said, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "It's a health hazard and a public nuisance." "Oh, I'm sorry, but I think there's been a misunderstanding." I handed them a copy of the county agricultural code to the inspector. "This is standard composting practice, fully protected under agricultural zoning laws." The inspector, a tired-looking man who had obviously dealt with these kinds of neighbor disputes before, examined my documents and compared them to his own notes. "Everything appears to be in order," he said finally. "Agricultural composting is a permitted use on this property and the pile meets all setback requirements." "But the smell!" one of the neighbors protested. "Agricultural activities are specifically exempt from residential nuisance ordinances," the inspector replied. "As long as it's a legitimate farming operation, there's nothing we can really do." I watched the color drain from the president's face as the reality of the situation sank in. For the first time since this conflict began, I held all the cards. "I'm just trying to be a good neighbor and follow standard community practices," I said, looking directly at her. "Isn't that what you wanted?" The group retreated to the subdivision, leaving me standing beside my perfectly legal, properly permitted, and magnificently aromatic compost pile. From my kitchen window I could see them gathered in an angry cluster, gesturing and arguing among themselves. My phone rang that evening, and the caller ID showed the association president's number. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "I'm listening." "This has gotten out of hand. Perhaps we can reach some kind of accommodation." "Well, what did you have in mind?" "If you move that pile and agree to maintain your property according to community standards, we might be willing to reduce the amount you owe us." I let the silence stretch for a long moment, listening to the sound of her breathing and the distant lowing of cattle from a neighboring ranch. "Here's my counteroffer," I said finally. "You withdraw the lien, drop all claims against my property, and pay my legal fees, and in return I won't exercise my agricultural rights to the fullest extent."
"That's ridiculous. We will never agree to that."
"Well, then I guess we will see how this plays out. Good luck with your community meetings this week. And by the way, I hear the weather is gonna be warm and still." She hung up without another word. The compost pile continued its work, breaking down organic matter and breaking down my neighbor's resistance with equal efficiency. The association office was flooded with complaints from residents who couldn't even open their windows or use their yards. Property showings were cancelled, the community pool sat empty despite the warm weather. More importantly though, cracks began to appear in their united front. I started receiving apologetic phone calls from association members who just wanted the smell to go away. Some offered to pay my legal fees themselves if I'd just move the pile, but the president held firm, convinced that backing down would destroy her authority and set a precedent for other problem properties, and she scheduled an emergency board meeting to discuss enhanced enforcement measures and hired a more expensive law firm to handle the case. The escalation suited me fine. Every day the pile aged and ripened, strengthening my negotiating position while weakening theirs. Agricultural work had taught me patience, and I was prepared to let this process take as long as necessary. The real victory was not the smell or the complaints or even the legal maneuvering. It was the look in their eyes when they realized that their perfect little world could be disrupted by someone who refused to play by their rules. They had built their kingdom on the assumption that everyone wanted to belong, that the threat of exclusion was enough to enforce compliance. They'd never dealt with someone who preferred exile to citizenship in their suburban empire. The war was far from over, but I had won the first real battle already. And as I stood on my porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky while the sweet scent of decomposition drifted across the valley, I felt something I had not yet experienced since moving to the ranch: complete and total satisfaction with a job well done. The process server arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was mucking out the barn. He looked distinctly uncomfortable as he approached, probably because the wind was carrying the full aromatic glory of my compost pile directly across the yard. "Are you the owner of this property?" he asked, breathing through his mouth. "That is me." He handed me a thick envelope with the kind of official seals that meant serious business. "You've been served. Have a good day." I waited until he drove away before opening it. The lawsuit was everything my lawyer had predicted it would be: a kitchen sink approach designed to overwhelm me with legal fees, foreclosure on the lien, injunctive relief to stop my farming activities, damages for diminished property values, and attorney fees that would bankrupt most people. The law firm representing the association was from the big city, the kind of place where lawyers wore suits that cost more than most people's cars. They had clearly done their homework, citing every possible statute and regulation that might give them leverage. But they'd also made a critical mistake. By escalating to a full lawsuit, they had triggered my lawyer's favorite strategy, the so-called nuclear option. "This is perfect," he said when I brought him the papers. "They've just given us everything we need to destroy them completely." "How so?" "They are asking for an injunction against your agricultural activities. That means we get to do discovery on their entire financial situation, their legal authority, and their decision-making process. Plus, they've opened themselves up to sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit." He leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who'd been waiting for this moment. "But here's the really good news. Since they want to restrict your farming activities, I need to do a complete historical review of your property rights. And that means going all the way back to the original land grants." The next week was spent in archives and record rooms digging through documents that predated the subdivision by decades. My lawyer had the focused intensity of a detective following a promising lead, requesting files and cross-referencing records with methodical precision. "Jackpot," he said finally, spreading a yellow document across his desk. The paper was old enough that the ink had faded to brown, but the legal language was still clear. It was an easement grant from the original ranch deed, nearly a century old, giving the property owner the right to drive livestock across the neighboring land to access water resources. "This cannot still be valid," I said, studying the archaic legal language. "Oh, but it is. Easements like this don't expire unless they are formally extinguished, and there's no record of that ever happening." The developer who built the subdivision either did not know about it or chose to ignore it. He pointed to a specific section of the document. "This gives you the right to move cattle across what is now their community park to reach the creek on the far side. It's a legitimate historical easement that predates their development by 70 years. And they cannot stop me? Not unless they want to challenge a property right that's been on the books since before their grandparents were born." Plus, you would be exercising a legitimate agricultural function which is protected under your zoning. The possibilities were intoxicating, but my lawyer held up a cautioning hand. The trick is timing. We need to make a maximum impact with minimum exposure. Do it wrong and we just look vindictive. Do it right and we end this war permanently. The opportunity presented itself in the most perfect way possible. So a flyer appeared in my mailbox advertising the association's annual community picnic scheduled for the weekend in their beautifully maintained park. According to the notice, it was their biggest event of the year, with families, food vendors and a bouncy castle for the kids. It's like they're asking for it. My lawyer said when I showed him the flyer, all we need to do is send proper legal notice that you intend to exercise your easement rights. How much notice do I need to give? Legally? Just 24 hours, but I would recommend 3 days just to show that we are being reasonable. The notice was a masterpiece of legal precision. It cited the original easement, referenced a specific section of county code that protected agricultural activities, and politely informed the association that I would be moving livestock across their property during daylight hours over the weekend. Their lawyer's response was swift and predictable, a frantic phone call demanding that I cancel my plans, followed by a hastily filed emergency injunction request, but the judge, after reviewing the century-old easement and the agricultural zoning laws, declined to interfere with legitimate farming activities. The day before the community picnic, I filed notice that I would be exercising my easement rights by moving cattle across the park early Sunday morning at 6 a.m., a full 3 hours before the event was scheduled to begin. Their lawyer tried for an emergency injunction, but the judge noted that I'd provided proper notice and chosen a time that was avoiding the event. The easement was legal and I was being reasonable about timing. Sunday morning arrived foggy and cool. We moved the 50 head across the park in the pre-dawn darkness, the cattle leaving clear evidence of their passage on the manicured grass. By the time the first of the families arrived at 9 a.m. for setup, we were long gone, but the park told the story of what had happened. The association president stood in the middle of the mess, staring at the torn up grass and scattered evidence of our passage. Several board members had come early to assess the damage and I could see them arguing, even from my distant vantage point on the hillside. The picnic was cancelled, the cleanup would take days and cost thousands, but more importantly, every resident now understood that their private park was not really theirs at all. It was subject to rights that predated the entire subdivision, and that evening my phone rang constantly. Not with angry complaints, but with calls from the association members demanding answers from the board. The community forum exploded with arguments between residents who blamed the president for escalating the conflict and those who still supported her hardline approach. The emergency board meeting was called for the next evening. I was not invited, but my lawyer attended as an observer, armed with documents and a settlement proposal that would end the matter permanently. The meeting was chaos from the beginning. Residents demanded to know how much money had been spent on legal fees, why they hadn't been informed about the easement, and what the board planned to do about the ongoing agricultural activities that were clearly gonna continue. The association president tried to maintain control, insisting that backing down would set a dangerous precedent and encourage other property owners to challenge their authority, but her support had evaporated. Board members who had previously rubber-stamped her decisions were now openly questioning her judgment. The financial reality was stark. The association's reserves had been depleted by legal fees, and their lawyer was demanding additional retainer payments to continue the fight. Meanwhile, my countersuit for slander of title and abuse of process was moving forward, potentially exposing them to damages that would bankrupt the entire organization. Here's what we are prepared to offer, my lawyer announced when the arguing died down. My client will agree to limit his livestock movements to daylight hours and provide 24-hour notice before exercising his easement rights. In exchange, you withdraw all claims against his property, pay his legal fees, and provide written acknowledgement that his land was never part of your association.
And if we refuse?
The president asked. Well, then we go to trial and where you will lose and face additional damages for the frivolous lawsuit. Plus my client will begin exercising his agricultural rights more extensively. And well, the vote was not even close. The board approved the settlement by a margin that left the president completely isolated. She resigned that night, selling her house within the month rather than face the daily reminder of her defeat. The settlement payment combined with the ongoing legal expenses bankrupted the association. Without sufficient funds to maintain common areas or enforce regulations, the organization dissolved entirely. The neighborhood reverted to a normal residential area governed by county codes rather than private covenants. And now let's read another interesting malicious compliance story. It is titled, I Apologize to My Mom. So my folks divorced when I was 8, my dad passed when I was 13, and by the time I was 18, my mom had been dating for a while. One day, Mom, her boyfriend, and I were sitting around the table cracking jokes and such, and my mom said one that was really off color. I was used to her sense of humor, I had it too. I looked over at Mom and said, "Mom, you're a dirty old lady." She chuckled at that, but her boyfriend got pissed. "That's no way to talk to your mother. You apologize to her right now." Well, cue malicious compliance. I turned to Mom and said in a very sincere voice, "Mom, I'm sorry, you're a dirty old lady." Before her boyfriend could say anything, she chimed in with, "I'm not sorry." Thank you for watching, please don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you again tomorrow.